So, how is it that that anointing is given? Is the question most received since last week. And that has been a question on my mind since. I suppose I went in a little deep on the idea of needing no one, citing 1 John 2:27, and how that highlights a specific anointing being the means whereby one can learn, the means whereby one can learn that anointing. And the question coming to me is this anointing legitimate? This is an anointing given by something invisible. This is an anointing given by something otherworldly. There is no official priest doing any sort of weird things to us. The question comes is, how does one get this anointing? And from where? And the my immediate response and my immediate thoughts, they go to Paul, because in the book of Galatians, the author writing the book of Galatians in the very first chapter says that they received everything they received concerning their gospel, not by any man, not by anyone, not by flesh and blood, they say, but by revelation. The author writing the book of Galatians in their very first chapter, they say that they received no information, no belief, no doctrine, no understanding, no guidance, no principles, no precepts from flesh and blood, from any other human being, from any other mind, from any other man, from any other minister, priest. They didn't receive one bit of anything from anyone, but received all things that they taught and had by revelation. And how? How is it that by revelation, the author writing the book of Galatians in their first chapter could let their reader know that should they have received what they received in any other fashion, they would have been a servant to the religious world, to priests and to the minds of priests and ministers. But because they stayed solitary, because at a point in time that grace should be revealed in them, not by anything from anyone, but by revelation. How? How did they do it? And that was the question that came to me pretty consistently from last week up until this point, is how is it possible to receive this anointing that we need no one? How can we grow so comfortable to receive this anointing? And I have here again some verses highlighted um, from the school or the thought of the philosophy of Paul from the book of Hebrews 5, chapter 5, 7, and 8. This is a really great illustration and very right to the point to answer that question. How is it that that anointing works? In Hebrews 5, 7, and 8, it reads, "Who in the days of his flesh, with strong crying and tears, though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered." Now, this goes back to the philosophy of the character called Paul. In every single one of the books outlined and put together by the character called Paul, or I should say, in a more concrete sense, by the philosophy that was Paul, the idea of suffering is the headline. In order for the individual, according to this philosophy's point of view, in order to connect with what should be called Christ, and in order to connect with what should be called God or the Father, one must pass through a system of suffering. The philosophy that this Paul lays out, I've outlined it plenty of times, is a philosophy that is what I like to call Messiah suffering. The Messiah suffering routine is that whereby suffering, one can somehow acquire vision, favor, eyesight of the divine or of the deity. And this is the argument of that Paul consistently, that it is by suffering not by any religious law, not by any religious ceremony, not by any religious belief, not by any religious advancement of such or of any kind of sort. As the author writing Peter says, that there Christ left them an example, so this Paul highlights the example of his Christ as being one that suffered to receive the position and the anointing that he received. And that is absolutely valid. At least on this one point, that Paul is spot on. And this Paul arrives at his conclusions due to the Psalms. The Psalms tell a different story, philosophically, from the philosophy of Moses. The philosophy of Moses, in the book of Deuteronomy, these are your virtues. This is your righteousness. These laws and these statutes that I give you among the nations, this is how they will know that you are a wise people and one separated. This is your righteousness to do. When you get to the Psalms, when you get to the Proverbs, remember, weeks ago we talked about the and the philosophy that the one writing the Proverbs is getting at by that. You get to the Psalms highlight that same philosophy of the and, but they add more context to it. The Psalms let us know that a broken heart, brokenness of the heart, brokenness of the spirit is the only sacrifice that matters to the living God. There is no ritual you can do, there is no routine, there is no nothing that you can do except offering up the brokenness of the spirit of your heart. Same thing in the book of Isaiah. I dwell with him that is of a humble and of a contrite spirit to revive. It's the book of Isaiah. The philosophy from Genesis to Malachi, it is a philosophy that is divided. On the one hand, you have the Moses philosophy. And the Moses philosophy is righteousness by religious law. On the other hand, you have the philosophy of the and, which is that there is no such thing as righteousness by the religious law. One is only right by the wisdom they acquire from exercising their thoughts and feelings on the scriptures and the mind therein. Now, the individual that Paul is highlighting as his Christ, he received his position, and I'm going to keep within the philosophy that Paul is giving. He received his position not by doing any law, because he was a Jew. He was a Jew faithful to the law of Moses. He was a Jew faithful to the seventh-day Sabbath. He was a Jew through and through. He was not a Christian. This was a Jew through and through. Only difference was his philosophy was revolutionary. Because keeping the law and doing everything according to Moses, it didn't stop him from getting killed. There was no blessing for that. So as the character called Paul is going through the scriptures and he's looking for an understanding of why this individual was chosen to receive the position that he received, the only thing that makes sense, according to the scriptures, is that this individual suffered for his position, and not suffered in a physical sense, because before the physical suffering, there is the mental suffering. Again, the book of Isaiah highlights, he wakeneth me morning by morning. He wakeneth me and teaches me as one of the learned. There is a mental process to receiving the kind of position that the example that the Pauls and the Peters are highlighting of their figure, their main figure. And it comes down to a willingness to suffer. The underlying scope of Paul's philosophical inquiry into how and why his Christ received the position that he received and its relevance is due to the man, while in the days of his flesh, through crying and suffering and praying in the midst of all of that, learning by the suffering that caused him to understand the level of obedience he needed to have to the words for which he suffered. And that's the formula. The formula for that anointing, the formula for receiving that particular anointing, it has to do with the individual mind willing to suffer for understanding. And I have here Proverbs 123 lightly quoted because Proverbs 123 gives the main element to what it means to have the Spirit poured out. The Spirit poured out, according to Proverbs 123, is the making known of words. I will pour out my Spirit unto you. I will make known my words unto you. When one is receiving of what the Bible calls that Spirit in plain language, Bible articulates itself by letting the individual know that they are receiving words. So it is when allowing the mind to suffer for understanding, what will be given is an outpouring of understanding. It is through this outpouring of understanding that one receives when suffering their conversation's mind, thoughts, feelings, actions, and behaviors on the character that is within the scriptures. It is from doing this that that anointing is received, and from that reception is exercised, and from that exercising, there is an understanding of how to maintain and regulate self by what is given, thereby fulfilling what that author in 1 John 2:27 is saying, you need no man to teach you, because you don't. Everything goes back, as was said last week. Sure, desire is key. Whatever one desires to know, one will separate themselves for it. Desire is key in order to making wisdom relevant. But once you have desire in place, what's next? I have a desire to learn. I have a desire for a specific understanding. Well, then you now have to engage yourself with that specific understanding, and that involves suffering, and not just suffering to understand, it also means suffering the lifestyle. Anything new that we bring into our life, anything that can change the trajectory to how we have been behaving and acting previously, that's going to cause some storms to rise up, not just within our mind, not just within ourselves, but it can be within our diet, it can be within how we behave, it can be within the kind of occupations we now look for, it can be within how we treat friends, family, it could be anything, but it's brought into life. That's the true, in a sense, form of that suffering when the philosophy then becomes real enough to affect the trajectory of the growth and the development of our personal devotional conversation. And that's the answer. And so when I received the question of, okay, so you're talking about the end, you're talking about desire, you're talking about wisdom, and well, we don't really need anyone to teach us. Well, that's really weird because I'm constantly finding myself needing someone to teach me. Okay, so if you're going to talk about how the Bible in 1 John 2:27 is talking about we don't need anyone to teach you, and then it's saying that that's because there is a specific anointing, well, then what is this anointing that we are supposed to get if this is what the Bible is saying? But that's not my experience. I've never experienced what the Bible is saying. So how do you get to that point? And that got my mind going completely because that's such a brilliant question. Brilliant question, brilliant thoughts. And my immediate response was Hebrews 5:7 and 8. Who through the days of his flesh, though he were a son, with strong crying and tears, learned is the key word I wanted to highlight there. Learned he obedience by the things which he suffered. Now, obedience to what? The Paul philosophy is saying that obedience doesn't come from maintaining self by law. A law led experience is not what their example Christ got to. in order to get the position that he got. Moses will say, do this, sure, keep them as frontlets between thine eyes, to pass down from generation to generation, yet do them. It is almost as if you have to do them. Well, you do have to do them for divine favor, but if you never do them, you will never be able to really comprehend the practice. Get to the Paul side of things, get to the Psalms side of things, get to the Proverbs side of things, get to the Isaiah side of things, and the philosophy of Moses kind of fades away because learning doesn't actually come from what is scripted. Obedience doesn't actually come from what is being told what to obey. That's the philosophy of Moses. That's the blueprint of the religious world. What Paul discovered when analyzing the scriptures was that genuine obedience to the things that are actually within the scriptures doesn't come from a scripted routine. It actually comes from suffering a part of self. And so that's a bit of the controversy that, when it comes to the character Paul, you get because Paul was an individual that gave, as he says in the second chapter of the book of Galatians, the gospel of the uncircumcision, citing that the gospel of the circumcision was given to them boys up in Jerusalem. Paul represented the church of Damascus. Paul represented the church of Antioch. Paul didn't represent the church of Jerusalem. And so the conflict between the two philosophies, that kind of changed things. Because you have on the one hand the philosophy of the church in Jerusalem saying, listen, our example maintained the law of Moses. Our example was specifically chosen to suffer for the law of Moses, not unintelligently, but intelligently, and became a set example for how we should prepare ourselves for the resurrection to come after. That's not what the church of Antioch taught, and specifically the Paul of that Antioch. This Paul of that Antioch, his Christ, was an individual that gained position, gained favor, not by doing any law, but by suffering. Of course, this philosophy goes into the body, but mostly mind to comprehend. So there's a conflict of interest there. Are you going to suffer your physical body through a law, or are you going to suffer your mind for learning a specific law for it? Not being given, as is the other, but for it. And that's where that anointing, when you enter into the sphere of 1 John 2:27 comes from. It is an anointing that is not literal. It is an anointing, if you can exchange that word for enlightenment, because that is Galatians 1 by revelation, the idea. And Proverbs 1:23, it is not actually any sort of fanatical thing that's going on here. What's actually happening is that as the individual conversation is suffering for understanding and is suffering the understanding it's acquiring, what's happening is that while it's giving out that, it's receiving words. Or as the language of Proverbs 1:23 says, I will pour out my spirit unto you, I will make known my words. The outpouring of that spirit from Genesis to Malachi is actually an outpouring of words. And this outpouring of words takes place as the individual conversation embraces necessary brokenness, primarily or firstly of the heart of the devotional conversation, trickling down to the being of the human. Once the heart of the conversation suffers that necessary brokenness, that is an experience that the being of the human is witnessing, And it is through such an experience that the cycle will continue and repeat. But it will never happen until the conversation first acknowledges brokenness. That's a continual theme, and that brokenness doesn't just happen out of nowhere. That brokenness takes place as the mind is dissecting, examining, and placing into practice the things that it is uncovering within the mind of the scriptures. This is how Hebrews 5, 7, and 8 learned he obedience. Learned he obedience by the things which he suffered. It is impossible to escape the philosophy of this Paul without placing into right context the notion of suffering. A suffering Messiah experience is the kind of experience that this Paul wants his audience to mimic, which is why there is no shame in this Paul to magnify the things that he has physically suffered in his body. He's not afraid, and he's very prideful to talk about the times his life was in jeopardy, the beatings that he took, the sufferings that he took, whether it be in the summer or the winter. He's not ashamed to talk about how many churches needed him to show proof that he was actually an apostle. I would rather much glory in mine infirmities, that the power of my God would be made manifest, is what he says to the Corinthians. For me to live, whether by living or by dying, it is gain, he says to the Colossians. This philosophy of suffering, and it gets extreme in a sense because it becomes more of a focus on the body, which is part of the philosophy that this Paul was pushing out only due to his background in Stoicism. But primarily, it is a mental thing. Go to Romans 7. Romans 7, the first 6, 7 verses, talking about the death to the letter of the law, for the regeneration for newness by the spirit of the mind. Ephesians 4, put off your former conversation and be renewed in the spirit of your mind. It is the mind primarily that is to first undergo what it's supposed to undergo, and then after that, that's that person's business. But the Bible's primary concern, create in me a clean heart and renew a right spirit within me, Psalm 51, is the mind. And it is the mind of the devotional conversation that is to receive a specific outpouring. I'll use outpouring instead of anointing. Receive a specific outpouring due to the suffering that it's supposed to have. And that suffering is a suffering of devotional conscience. That outpouring is an outpouring of words. The more that the conversation is taking in and exercising words, the more that it will receive an outpouring of words. It's a system. As a car continually needs gas to go on, or even in electricity, so too the devotional conversation needs its substance to keep going. And the more substance taking in, the more substance is supposed to be let out for an experience, for use, so that more substance can be taken in, for more substance to be taken out for more use. That substance being, going back to the ant, a gathering of understanding for times in need. And that's where the inspiration for this came from, due to that one thought of, if that anointing exists and this is what it's saying, how come I find myself continually not receiving such an anointing, but needing to tend to what is said, needing to tend to what I believe instead of maybe not fact? Well, the answer is Going back again last week to the proverb concerning desire and one separating themselves for wisdom through it. Sure, there is a desire to separate for wisdom, but attached to that desire to separate for wisdom is an understanding for a need to suffer for what has been separated for. So we can't just think that I have the desire, I'm just going to sit down and get wisdom, I'm just going to sit down with the Bible and read. I'm reading my Bible every day, I'm good. I have my belief in me, I don't need the Bible, I'm good. So it doesn't end that way from a practical sense, according to the philosophy that is within the scriptures. Now, if you're actually believing what you believe, if you're actually sitting down and reading, you have to put what you're believing and what you're reading to use. You have to actually suffer for what you're believing. That means your life has to go through a sort of philosophical change in the trajectory of your former belief, of your reading. It has to increase. Your belief can't stay the same as it was 16 years ago. The belief passed down to you from mother, from father, from pastor, from person on a screen, that can't be the same 5 years later, 1 year later, 10, 15. It's just, it makes no sense because that's just not how things go. Nobody that's learning how to cook has the same skill that they began with 2 years later, 6 months later, 1 year later. Nobody that's learning how to read has the same reading level 6 weeks, 7 months, a year, 2 years. Everything increases. So if we're having the same belief that we've had all our life, and we're believing that's it, if we're reading the same things over and over, and it's now getting to the point where we don't care to read anymore, we just know. Well, that's a devotional conversation that is plateaued. You actually, we actually know nothing. Bible understands this habit, and Bible wants to break it. How? Again, the character Paul, dissecting the scriptures, understood the formula. It wasn't about a specific law that one did that cured them of anything. It was not a specific religious law that one did that granted them favor, divine favor. That's Hebrews 10, 1 and 2. That's Hebrews 9. It's Romans 6 and 7. It's Galatians 3. The character Paul, going through the scriptures, understood that there was something more profound than simply doing a law over and over again and getting nowhere, because you're getting nowhere. You're still the same. And you may be even worse because you're hiding you by a routine. So, how is it that, according to the scriptures, one is supposed to give pure and unadulterated obedience to the mind therein if there is no use of a religious law doing anything for anybody, because they all always end up with a conscience for sin yet and still? And even their routine, as the author of the book of Hebrews points out, once a year is a purging for sin. It is never forgotten, it is never gone, it's just there. How can you be better, not just in your belief, but as a man, as a woman? How can you be better with a setup like that? You can't. Impossible. But if you look at the way that the philosophy of the scriptures is broken down from the Psalms and from the Proverbs, from Isaiah, from Genesis, and so on, there is an underlying philosophy of blessing. Not simply just an imaginary blessing of some divine eye looking at one, but blessing to the conscience, renewal of heart through suffering the spirit of the mind. And not just for any lame reason and not just on anything, suffering the spirit of the mind on the particular words and counsel by the particular experience that is within the scriptures. Doing so, allowing the mind to understand a philosophy that is greater than what is already or than what is within it, We now have something to weigh ourselves by. You don't have anything to weigh yourself by when you're simply doing a ritual. You're, as I always like to reference in Peter concerning baptism, how the author writing Peter states that baptism does absolutely nothing in reality. It is only to appease the conscience. That's all we're doing. But the character Paul, the author writing the Psalms, the author writing the Proverbs, the author writing the book of Isaiah, the author writing the book of Job, they want to get at something more intimate and more personal, something more concrete than simply hiding behind a ritual. And that is not hiding behind self, that is confronting you. And so, looking at the mind within the scriptures from that point of view, we have now an advantage, a very great advantage, because we no longer have to hide behind some sort of routine. We can actually measure ourselves by something greater than ourselves, and by the something, by words greater than the words that are already within us. And so we can gain correction from such an experience, and such an experience, though not pleasurable, as the author yet writing the Hebrews makes plain, we have suffered under our fleshly parents and have suffered their whatever they would do when we did not behave right. Why not suffer for the invisible mind, for our invisible Father? Same concept is you need no one to teach you. The anointing rests within you. It is going through that experience, building up a level of confidence on the power that is within those words, recycling and rehashing out what that means, and going at self by them. That is how one receives that outpouring. Again, I'm exchanging outpouring for anointing. So I'll just end there for whatever we are going through this week, to keep focused on what suffering we can apply from what we have taken in from the scriptures, whatever we're going through. Because if we can go through something and it's very distasteful, but yet remember a principle that we have received from the scriptures and apply that, that's right suffering. And in that right suffering will be a right principle, and a right principle for a right experience, for right wisdom. That's the sort of experience that the Bible is after. That's the kind of anointing, that's the outpouring of words that the Bible wants us to make use of when we don't really make light of the experience, but handle it